In this lesson of the AI-powered design and training, we're going to talk about universal design for learning and accessibility. So, what is UDL? Universal Design for Learning is design that anticipates variability and reduces barriers as much as possible. There's three general values that we're going to cover in here, along with 7 principles that you can apply in your own trainings. What UDL really champions is this multimodal design and provides multiple ways to access and engage content so that learners can approach things in the way that works best for them. So the first value within UDL is this idea of representation. So present information in different ways and with varied responsive stimuli. So what does that mean? In audio content, that could be providing access for those who learn better through listening. For visualization, it could be visual representations of complex information. Maybe there's some kind of chart that you can use or process flow or so on. Marked up PDFs and documents, so each document follows markup conventions from WCAG standards for web accessibility. And responsive stimuli as well. So, how do you make the stimuli appropriate and relevant for the people that you're working with? Do the people look like the individuals that you are teaching within that environment? How are you going to consult and ensure that that's something that's happening? So, this representation component here is to really say what are some of these different ways that we can present the information based on someone's learning style or biological needs. The next component is action and expression, so differentiated and individualized ways that students can express what they know. In short, not everybody can do the same things over and over and over again. Some people are not good at taking tests. Some people are not good at providing assignments that are written. Some people are not good at doing other components, or they're just not comfortable doing so. There's other ways that they feel more comfortable to truly show that they learned and understood the information. Not everything has to be multiple choice, not everything has to be a written assignment. And although this course has some of those components in here, we try to show that here are other ways to show that we've learned this information. That's why we create these self-paced components. So you can have a project-based approach for a final project or a portfolio of sorts. So allowing for creative demonstration of knowledge that could be a variety of different things. Maybe someone is creating a podcast. Maybe someone's creating a visual project in terms of a poster or a sculpture or a different type of way to show that they've taken the information that you have given and now they're able to apply it in the way that makes sense with their own learning style. And the third value within universal design learning is engagement, stimulating interest and motivation for learning by connecting to the values of the learners. If the information is not important to the learners, forcing someone to learn those components is going to be very difficult and it can be very, very abrasive, right? Do this because it becomes a compliance thing and we don't want that to happen. We want to create some level of choice. Maybe there's options to increase autonomy and motivation, to increase the person's ability to make a choice in a particular situation. Maybe they can choose which way they would like to engage with the content. Are they going to do it more visually? Do they want a podcast for this? Do they want hands-on experience? If you can offer as many choices as possible to engage with this material, that's what we want you to try to do. That's why all of our materials in this program here that you're taking right now has visualizations to it, has different ways to approach this within the other lessons, and has written and audio information everywhere as well as assignments that show different ways to actively engage. Speaking of active engagement, you want to make sure that the person is actually interacting with the materials and not just being lectured at. So yes, there are lecture components, kind of like what we're doing now, but we want to make sure that the person can engage with materials in a way that makes sense. Maybe there's a little game that can be played, maybe a small assignment that can be applied, and so on. And again, you have to make sure that this is relevant. The content is connected to the learner's lives and goals as much as possible. Why is someone working where they are? What about that job do they like? How can you implement that into the training that you have? So beyond these values, there's 7 general principles of universal design. Now, universal design used to be mainly around architectural components, but this has been recently, well, I should say more recently, applied to learning spaces as well, not just the built space that we physically engage with, but spaces like this, online spaces. So the first one being we want equitable use. So the design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities and approaches. So example would be using captions and transcripts for all video. This works because it's inclusive of deaf and hard of hearing folks. It's a non-example of this would be posting videos without captions. So if you're not using those captions, that's not good. So it fails with this non-example here, so posting videos without captions, because it excludes people. So for each of these 7, you can kind of see that on one side it's showing examples and why it works, and non-examples and why it fails. Pay attention to this, because we need to understand both sides of this, not just what works, but maybe what's being done currently that's not so effective. The next principle is flexibility in use. So a design that accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. So an example of this, so something that you should go for, would be offering both digital and printed worksheets, so different ways to approach a particular component. This works because it accommodates different preferences and needs. A non-example of this, or maybe where this fails, is providing only one way to engage with this material. And this fails because, again, students with screen readers might not be able to use this or may not be able to physically write these components. That's why in this course that we have here, we have audio, visual, and written so that people can engage with these things in multiple different ways, but still get the same information, and that's the important component of this. You want to make sure that your information is also perceptible. So this design communicates necessary information to effectively have the user understand what is going on, regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. So what do I mean by this? When something is perceptible, they're literally able to engage with something. So right now, if you're hearing what I am saying, that's perceptible for your audio. If you're visually seeing what I'm saying from the caption, that's perceptible to your visual, and so on. So an example of this would be high contrast slides, kind of like what you see in front of you. The background is very dark, the letters are a little bit more bold, and there's high visual color contrast associated with this. Non-examples would be like pastel colored slides, very light with no image descriptions and so on, right? So you have to understand with your learners how are they engaging in the materials and what types of perceptive approaches do they have? Do they need screen readers to engage with your materials, right? Like imagine you're doing an HR training and the people in your company can't actually engage with your training. Well, if that person then doesn't follow along with a particular rule or policy, if they weren't able to engage with the material, that's not on them, right? We need to make sure that you are able to present your information in a way that people can actually engage with. Next is simple and intuitive to use. So the design itself is easy to understand, regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or concentration level. So an example of this would be using clear language and icons and navigation menus. You should have clear start to finish on how to find the information when they need to find it, right? A non-example of this would be having very abstract menus, menu names, acronyms, jargon, things like that that people might not be able to engage with. If you do too much of that, using too much jargon, using too much industry-specific terminology and so on, or the way that people are interacting with your site is not very intuitive, this can be very, very problematic. So this can cause confusion and increase learning barriers because if the person's not able to do it, they might just flip to the next page without actually absorbing the information that you're trying to teach, right? If you decided that your information is worthwhile and worth teaching and taking the time to do this, make sure that people can actually engage with the materials that you're doing on the platforms that you're using. The next component here is tolerance of error. So the design minimizes hazards and adverse conditions of accidental or unintended actions. What this means is, can folks engage with the training without having fear of constantly being wrong, and when they are wrong, being punished for doing so? So could we give people more time to engage with things? Can you allow draft submissions of maybe you're doing an IEP report or an RFP or something like that? How do you reduce the pressure of learning something new when the stakes aren't as high, right? So a non-example of this would be, well, this is the one time you can hand this thing in, and if it's wrong, you fail, right? Or if it's wrong, you're fired. You want to make sure that, especially with new topics, new approaches, new tactics, that individuals are able to practice this in a safe way, in a way that if they make errors, they're not horribly punished for doing so. So some ideas could be undoing or redoing a particular approach. Maybe you get feedback. If you've already taken a quiz in this course, you can see that we give feedback before you move on to the next quiz. Confirmation dialogues and autosave features so that the person doesn't have to think about doing 3 different tasks to save something before they move forward. High stakes errors, too, are maybe you only get 1 chance to pass, or no draft options, small targets, high force requirements, and so on. You have to avoid some of those components. So making sure that the environment is set up so that if the person does fail or does do something incorrectly, it's not the end of the world. You also want low physical effort, so literally making this more easy to physically engage with something. So if you're using online quizzes, maybe you have large clickable buttons. It's easier for students with motor difficulties, but just for folks in general, right? So a non-example would be requiring handwritten timed responses, which might be difficult for individuals with cognitive disabilities or cognitive considerations. Doing things under time can be incredibly stressful. And then if you're doing handwriting, if someone has some kind of impairment or some kind of bodily structure that makes writing difficult, or there's fatigue over time, that affects the way that that person can engage. Now, that doesn't mean that the person didn't learn. This goes back to that multiple means of engagement and representation and expression, because if the person's not able to show that they have that information in the way that they can do it, then you're only forcing that person to learn a particular way, and that's not fair for that individual. The next one being size and space for use. So literally the built space or the environmental space online is appropriate size and space for that person to reach, to manipulate the objects, regardless of user's body size, posture, and mobility. So if you're in a classroom or you're in a workshop, how do you arrange the desk with wide walkways for mobility aids? This works because it can ensure access for students with wheelchairs. A non-example of this would be tightly packed seating. I've been in many different learning situations, learning environments within built spaces. Some lecture halls are very, very skinny and they're sloped with only stairs to go up, so individuals in wheelchairs would have to sit in the front, or individuals that have other mobility aids might not be able to, without significant distress or fatigue, get up to other portions of the seats, and that's not fair for individuals because that person is there to learn and engage with what's going on. Right? So you want to make sure that your learning space is physically accessible to the people that you're trying to teach. So what I want you to think about with this is a redesign challenge, even an action plan. So I want you to think of a specific task. So define your task. What are you expecting people to do? So very clearly define what that is. For a barrier, what is getting in the way of that person doing it now? Do they understand this? Is it a want to problem? Maybe the individual's not motivated to do it. Or is it a know how problem? Do they even know what they're supposed to be doing? Right? And then within this task and barrier, what principle of UDL is being used? Is this one of the 7 principles that we just reviewed? And how can you adjust for that? Right? What is the tactic that you're going to do to utilize that principle to adjust the barrier? Then specifically, what are you going to measure in this particular case to show progress, right? You can't just say, well, I feel like they're doing better, right? Well, when it comes time for that person's promotion and there's not any metrics because you didn't take any as a supervisor, but then that person says, I worked really hard on this, look at what I accomplished. If you're not taking measurements, that's not fair to that individual. But you also have to make sure that the measurements are specific enough to that person given the way that they approach things. So if you say word count, but that person didn't utilize a project that implemented word count, that measurement sucks, right? And then you have to have a timeline associated with this as well. Like, what is your timeline to check in? What is the timeline for that person to finish? Can you extend the timelines and so on? So think of a design challenge that you have that has a specific task. What barriers are getting in the way of that? What principle of UDL is being utilized? How are you going to address that? What tactic are you using to address those barriers? How are you going to measure progress? And what is the timeline in which you're going to do that in? And here are references for this. So if you haven't signed up for the course already, check out our AI power training and design